For Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are still taking place across the United States today. An anti-racism rally is to be held in honor of his work as a civil rights activist. And of course, U.S. President Donald Trump tweeting earlier, acknowledging King's death anniversary, his legacy of peace and his impact on uniting Americans. We're now joined by our correspondent in Washington, Nina Maria Potts, to tell us a little more. Nina, I mean, they came in early, they came in droves all over America, from all over America to Memphis, Tennessee to honor this special day in America's history.
That's right. I'm standing here on the National Mall. It's a very windy day here in Washington, D.C., and the nation's capital, where an anti-racism rally and a silent march has played out during the course of the day. Of course, it's particularly poignant here in Washington, D.C., because this is the site of some of Martin Luther King's most famous speeches. And on the night that he was assassinated, Washington, like many other major U.S. cities, broke out in violent protests. His assassination really unleashed a wave of mourning and reflection and anger at a very critical time in the American civil rights movement. And today, organizers say that this rally should really be a reflection and a reminder of the current state of race relations in this country. African Americans, as you know, are still disproportionately suffering, I think, from high rates of unemployment, murder rates, and also in many cases at the hands of the police, the U.S. police, in accidents and scenes of quite violent police brutality.
As I understand it, the plan is to ring bells across America at 6 p.m. your time, which of course are going to be rung 39 times in honor of the time that he died and his age at the time that he died on this day in 1968.
I'm struggling to hear you, I'm afraid, because of the wind. I caught some of what you said, but events will play out and continue to play out across the nation, and the events are far from over. I think one of the points that I wanted to mention here is that if you ask Americans 1 year into President Donald Trump's presidency whether or not race relations have improved in this country, recent polls suggest that 60% of Americans feel that race relations are much worse than they were just a year ago. 30% feel that there's been no difference at all. President Trump is perceived to have been, despite his tweeting in support of today, as somebody that has been divisive in his rhetoric and unable to unite white Americans with African Americans. I hope you can hear me.
But let me try again. The question I wanted to ask you was that I understand that part of the plan tonight at 6 p.m. is to ring bells across America 39 times in honor of the age that Martin Luther King Jr. died at, and of course the time of his death on this day in 1968.
Yes, I caught part of that. Again, I'm really sorry that the line is terribly bad and it's incredibly windy. But Martin Luther King and his death and his assassination, if you remember, he was assassinated on the balcony of his motel in 1968 on the 4th of April, 50 years ago, and that event, that single event, provoked a wave of reaction across America, and it's been a stunning turnout. We've had Martin Luther King's son speak at events leading up to today's events, and he has spoken out about shootings and the gunning down of African Americans, most recently in Sacramento just a few days ago, where an African American young man was shot by police for simply carrying a cell phone and not listening to police orders. So a high level of emotion over those events, and I'm sorry I didn't catch the rest of the question. Back to you.
Are we expecting any message, any speeches, any participation from former President Barack Obama on this day?
President Barack Obama has spoken out and joined in hundreds of thousands of African Americans in commemorating the day. And I think his participation in events means a great deal to the African American community. And if you think back to his election and the fact that he served 2 terms in office as America's first black president, there's a great deal of warmth and embrace and sense of an atmosphere that has somewhat been lost. Americans, I think, worry about the next future flashpoints. If you think about towns like Charlottesville in Virginia, which only a few months ago erupted in violence, and if you think about reports of the white supremacist movement growing in numbers here in the United States, I think there's a sense of nostalgia for the days of President Barack Obama among the African American community, and also a real sense of loss over drawbridge up politics that seem to be pervading America and the public debate today.
You spoke about how violence flared up in the immediate aftermath of Dr. King's assassination. When we look back 50 years later, how much has been gained, how much has been lost, particularly in wake of the movement such as Black Lives Matters that we've seen?
It's a very, very good question. I think the Black Lives Matters movement has really brought a lot of attention to the plight of African Americans. As I say, all you have to do is pick any subject, whether it's incarceration or illiteracy or employment, and you look at the numbers in the African American community and look at how disadvantaged they've been. You'll see that America, on some levels, has not moved forward at all. In fact, if there are parallels to be drawn between America and South Africa, you know, there was that very famous picture of Martin Luther King's widow, Coretta King, embracing Winnie Mandela. There was a series of very famous photographs when they finally met, the 2 wives of iconic figures in the South African context and, of course, in the American context. Back then, many people thought that South Africa had a great deal to learn from America and from Martin Luther King and the American civil rights movement. If you fast forward 50 years to today, commentators and analysts are talking about America needing to look to South Africa as the rainbow nation, as an example to set for a society that in some ways has not moved further on at all.
All right, we'll leave it there with you, Nina, in Washington. Of course, celebrations in America throughout today, honoring the life of Dr. King. But a lot of questions still being asked about whether or not his struggle was worth it, or whether or not the gains of the civil rights movement have been reversed, particularly in a Trump presidency.